Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Alya Shandra. I'm the editor of an English language platform, Euromaidan Press, and my story is basically that I left behind my former life as a researcher in environmental studies to document the story of the Euromaidan revolution, and I've been fascinated by Ukraine's social transformations ever since. So I'm very happy for this invitation and chance to speak at this conference. As you all know, its topic is dedicated to the Revolution of Dignity, but actually nobody knows who coined the term Revolution of Dignity for Euromaidan Revolution. It somehow appeared and stuck. And it resonated so much with this observation that we had at the very end of the protest, that searching for Europe, we found ourselves. And it basically described a burning desire for another way of life of the protesters and hope of things changing for the better in the upheaval of 2013 and 2014. But what actually remained unclear was what this differently entailed. It was clear that what is this other life? It was clear that life in Ukraine was perceived as being undignified compared to life in the EU. And the general notion was that there in the EU, its citizens have a totally another level of dignity. The life is organized in a more dignified way. But little thought was given as to why this was the case. And during the Euromaidan protests, and even now, the most common denominator for explaining why life in Ukraine is different from life in the EU is that we have bad political elites. Therefore, we must get rid of these political elites, and then life will somehow improve. But large was the surprise of a great part of society when this did not happen. So after Euromaidan, you know that the former government was, the officials were illustrated, there were new elections, and there was a turnover in the political sphere somehow. But nevertheless, in 2016, an online poll by Counter-TNS, it revealed that only 5% of Ukrainians felt that Euromaidan achieved its goals. 75% of the respondents said that it didn't. And 28% explained that there are no changes, and other reasons were that life became worse, that economic standards have fallen, there is a war, that those who came to power were worse than their predecessors, that oligarchs were in power, etc., etc. So we see that most people in Ukraine feel that the revolution of dignity did not result in a more dignified way of living now today. But what is also interesting is that this poll stands in contrast with the actual demands of Euromaidan, which were Euro integration, the resignation of the Yanukovych government, an early election, freedom to political prisoners, freedom of the media, and freedom of assembly, all of which were severely curtailed during the Yanukovych era. Also amnesty to Euromaidan participants. And partly fulfilled after the Euromaidan revolution were demands to punish the police that beat up the students and shot the protesters at Euromaidan, to lustrate officials and to fight corruption. So basically we see that on Euromaidan, the protesters had a very specific set of requirements, and many of them were fulfilled. Actually, most of them were fulfilled. So the Yanukovych government resigned, there was political changes, etc., etc. But nevertheless, most Ukrainians feel that Euromaidan did not achieve its goals. And the reason is because everybody was expecting a more dignified way of living and changes in that direction. But at the same time, Ukrainians, as feeling that life was undignified, Ukrainians also thought that the needed changes would happen somehow without them, that magically Euromaidan would transform life in Ukraine. And this brings us to the question of what actually dignity is, and what constitutes a dignified life. Maybe adding to the confusion of what it is has to happen in order for for life in Ukraine to be more dignified, is the fact that dignity is notoriously difficult to pin down. The concept is difficult to give a precise definition. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted after World War II, exemplifies this. As is known, its creators were conscious of the fact that the notions of dignity are shaped by the philosophical values of specific societies and countries. And there will never be agreement on what dignity is between different cultures. But nevertheless, the creators of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they lay down two fundamental approaches to human rights that were to safeguard human dignity. The first of these approaches is basically a set of political values that seek to protect individuals from interference of the state. And these were the political values shared by Western countries and the US in particular. And the second set of values were social economic values that ensured that gave the state an obligation to ensure living standards for citizens, such as housing, education, work, etc. But this fundamental document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it doesn't describe what dignity is. It doesn't give a definition. It's perceived to be self-evident. And other international declarations and treaties, they do not give a definition of dignity either. So, interestingly, I had trouble finding a definition of the word dignity when I was preparing for this conference, and I was searching for an etymology of the word Gідність, which is the Ukrainian translation of dignity, and the revolution of dignity is Революції Гідності. Modern Ukrainian etymological dictionaries, they just don't have the word, which was a big surprise for me because this concept should have been so fundamental for Ukraine after Euromaidan, but nevertheless, it's very difficult to find a definition. But nevertheless, digging into etymological dictionaries of the past, it revealed that the word dignity in Ukrainian, it has two meanings, two tints of meanings. And the first one, it's the aspect of inherent dignity, which is a dignity that is endowed upon all human beings, and we all share it equally. And there's a non-inherent dignity, which is basically the notion that this dignity can be enhanced or lost by means of engaging in virtuous and non-virtuous behavior. So the first one is a passive dignity that we all have, and we are supposedly all equal in it. And the second aspect is that it's an active dignity by which human beings can either live a more or less dignified life, which is, they're somehow even contradictory, these aspects of meanings. Nevertheless, this contradiction and these tints of meaning, they don't answer the main question. What is the blueprint based on which persons either have equal worth by default, or based on the correspondence to which behavior is deemed virtuous or non-virtuous? Well, Christians have an answer. It is because we are made in the image of God and we are His beloved children. And although every person is made in the image of God, some persons trample this image in themselves and others. But in my opinion, however, churches have not used the chance offered by the revolution of dignity to propel these ideas. And this is something we will discuss further. So, although it's difficult to identify what exactly dignity means for Ukrainians, we can actually see what they see as violating dignity by tracking large protests that happened before and after Euromaidan. Going from the negative, there are actions that trigger Ukrainians' feelings of their dignity being violated. And although we can't really define what dignity is, we definitely know when it's violated. So we have to recall the protest at Vradiivka. So during Vradiivka in 2013, there was a horrific rape and murder attempt by members of the police. And this sparked widespread indignation and just national protests to end police impunity. And some see these protests as a precursor to the Euromaidan revolution. So basically, we see in these protests a reaction of Ukrainians to injustice and inequality, of Ukrainians before the law, where some The police were deemed to be more equal than others, and this is a violation of inherent dignity that we are all supposed to be equally endowed with. But as well, there were demands to punish officials, the police, who had violated the dignity that is supposed to be associated with their rank. So, Euromaidan, also large protests that were triggered by feelings of indignity, and namely police impunity, social injustice and inequality, officials behaving in an undignified way in violation of basic human rights. But as well, in Euromaidan, we see that the Kantian notion of dignity, in which human beings are always an end in themselves and never a means, is also being invoked. Ukraine and the will of its citizens not to be an item to be manipulated and behind the curtain agreements on scrapping the EU association agreement, a rejection of the rights of Ukraine to its autonomy and independence, and deprivation of Ukraine's freedom to shape its own future were seen as inadmissible and violating dignity. Euromaidan connected dignity with freedom, the freedom of Ukraine and Ukrainians to make their own choice. And we're reminded of this every year on the 21st of November when we celebrate the Day of Dignity and Freedom, which also marks the start of the Euromaidan protests. And this notion about Ukraine's freedom to shape its own way and the violation of dignity associated with a covert Russian invasion and coercion to do Russia's will was the basis of the movement of the volunteer movement in the anti-terrorist operation. And hundreds of thousands of peoples took up arms because this covert Russian invasion was a breach of the dignity of Ukraine and its citizens, to be deprived of the freedom to choose their own path. And we see here a firm connection of dignity to the national liberation movements, which happened in the 20th century, and basically many people see the current war in Donbass as also a continuation of these national liberation movements. And the freedom and dignity connection, it was brought to prominence once again in the recent movement against capitulation protests, at the core of which is the persuasion that a current Zelensky administration is giving in to Russian demands in the war in Donbass, and consequently denying Ukraine the dignity of freedom of choice. And it's not coincidental that the next large event of the movement against capitulation is set to take place on 21st of November, the Day of Dignity and Freedom, and anniversary of Euromaidan. But at the same time, we mustn't forget that the economic dimension of dignity, they were important before Euromaidan, and they're still important now. The economic crisis, inflation, rising prices are issues that lead many to believe that things are worse off after Euromaidan, and therefore see the revolution of dignity as having failed. And right now in Ukrainian society, there is a visible tendency of the activist part to dismiss these economic concerns of the larger share of the population as something not enlightened enough and something primitive. But we mustn't forget that socioeconomic rights are part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and a major reason for Ukrainians leaving Ukraine to search for a better life abroad. Well, these are all concepts and observations of dignity that could have been illuminated in our media and could have been talked about by churches, but they weren't. So these are basically, I think, a potential that has been lost in the years after Euromaidan, but not all is lost. This brings, and these economic concerns, they bring us to the next anchor point of our discussion about dignity after Euromaidan. It's Ukraine's Soviet, or rather post-totalitarian heritage. It appears to me that it is exactly the Soviet past which defines much of what Ukrainians perceive to be wrong with their country without even realizing it. Because the USSR, a country with no political freedoms, where freedom of thought and pursuit of truth were punished, where a person was never an end in himself, but a cog in the machine, supposedly driving humanity towards a communist utopia, it left our society traumatized. And the results of this we still reap today. In exchange, Soviet citizens were guaranteed a social minimum, even if it was of substandard quality. So this concept of dignity and human rights, where a person surrenders political rights in exchange for subsistence minimum, that is basically the foundation for dignity in post-Euromaidan Ukraine. But it's slowly but being changed. But it has many implications for today, such as the paternalism and infantility of Ukrainian society, the culture of systematic corruption, because any criticism of the Soviet system was equated to treason, so basically we have this culture still going on today. Low civic activity and low responsibility, and a high tolerance of injustice, and as well something that really, it never fails to drive me mad as a confidence is that your actions will change nothing. This comes from a culture of keeping your head down and staying down and not speaking up, because of course in the Soviet Union you would be punished for this. So in the post-totalitarian country, which is Ukraine, lamentably little is said about the impact that this post-totalitarianism has on us today. So decommunization that happened after Euromaidan, although it was praiseworthy, it antagonized society because there has been no proper discussion about the true impact of totalitarianism on our society. So the decommunization that happened, it descended in a battle of narratives, a battle of historical figures. And I think it is the lack of discussion about dignity and the freedom of persons to shape their own path and hold their own opinions that is leading Ukrainian society to the polarization that we see today. And this is well exemplified by Alya Shandra, who was speaking just a few days ago in Mariupol at a conference on unity. So Alya Shandra is an activist on Euromaidan who was, and a filmmaker who was later captured and spent more than 5 years in a Russian prison. And when he was released recently in a prisoner exchange, many said that he encapsulated the spirit of Euromaidan. He's like a time machine that brings us back to these times when there was so much hope for life in Ukraine changing and so much optimism. And he made this observation that the revolution of dignity has morphed into a counter-revolution of hatred, where basically people are very intolerant of dissenting views that are different from their own, and that there's a holy war going on between Ukrainians of different political strains instead of working together to build society into a more dignified country that we all wanted on Euromaidan. So we have been talking about all of these narratives that could have been discussed after Euromaidan, and of course the next logical question is, where is the voice of the church in all of this? I believe that a discussion around dignity and what it entails will surely help Ukraine move forwards, but what seems to have happened is that Ukrainians feel that life in Ukraine is undignified but don't reflect on the reasons, and expecting changes to happen without their participation. But changes will not happen without a moral renovation, and particularly without addressing the reasons that our society is in such a state after living in a totalitarian country of the Soviet Union. Churches could add their unique voice to the discussion, especially since most of what is intuitively understood by dignity in Ukraine pertains to inherent dignity, which the Ukrainian state is seen as continuously violating, but very little is said about the non-inherent dignity, which requires active, virtuous behavior of all people, and about the responsibility that comes with freedom. So far, the churches have been reserved in participating in the processes that shape Ukraine's transition to a more dignified society. And the push for Ukraine's progress along this path, it has been associated with various civil activists who protest, for instance, attacks against activists, against state capitulation, for honest judges, and against corruption. Churches have taken a neutral stance in where they could be proactive in pushing Ukrainians to live out their calling as persons made in the image of God. And I personally felt this acutely during the protests in Radiivka, so in 2013, the horrific rape and murder attempt. And I wrote an open letter to the All-Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations for them to react somehow to this appalling violation of human rights. And this brought results. They did react, and then they even offered to give some courses to the police for a moral renovation of some sort. But I feel that these are the things that churches should be reacting without activists pushing them and prodding them to do so, because it is precisely a moral renovation that Ukraine needs. So the participation of churches in the Euromaidan revolution, it was commendable. But from where I stand, later their voice and the attempts to change Ukraine into a better place could have been louder. At least from what I can tell from the official communication channels. Well, in the major confessions in Ukraine, the Orthodox churches, Moscow Patriarchate and Orthodox Church of Ukraine, are mired in political battles. And their voice in the discussion about dignity and the path of Ukraine after Euromaidan is virtually unheard. If we, of course, do not take into account, I'm talking about the official communication channels and not lovely initiatives such as the Open Orthodox University, which of course is one of the most progressive voices that is systematically working in this direction. But if we talk about the official narratives coming through these churches and not church activists, this is precisely the case. They are just, it's all a political battle for them right now. So a Google search on the leaders of these churches and the word dignity revealed that Metropolitan Epifani stated that the tomos for the Orthodox Church of Ukraine would not have been possible without the revolution of dignity. And Metropolitan Alexander is suing the Moscow Patriarchate for violating his dignity. And meanwhile, a Moscow Patriarchate leader, Metropolitan Onufriy, stated that Ukrainians must be dignified inheritors of Saint Volodymyr. So this is the who baptized Kyiv and Rus in 988. So, of course, this is a reference to dignity, but it is somehow far placed from the events of our time. So, in comparison to this, the Greek Catholic Church positively stands out, of course. Its ex-leader Lubomir Huzar, he wrote a book titled The Dignity of Adam and regularly addressed questions of human dignity and where Ukrainian society is going. And dignity is something addressed by current Greek Catholic leader Sviatoslav Shevchuk as well. So we see that the Greek Catholic Church is actually now quite consistent in promoting messages of dignity and raising questions of how Ukrainian society should develop. But one common issue with the church messaging regarding dignity, if we take into account not only the word dignity, but all different aspects of social life, is that the churches tend to focus on challenges facing human dignity in Western countries at present, those related to bioethics and sexual politics. So notions of social liberalism imported from the West are uncritically assimilated in Ukraine as pertaining to human rights. And ultimately, human dignity, which comes together in a package with the achievements for human dignity in the decades before the advent of sexual politics. So basically, social liberalism is seen as something that is by default, it goes together with a high degree of human dignity. So the churches, which, while raising concerns about the implications of these politics, they risk appearing reactionary and retrograde if this is the only thing that they focus about, and if they don't focus on the larger building blocks of society and the larger issues of human dignity, and don't actively participate in the transformation of society, the demand for which became clear after Euromaidan. And Ukraine actually has a wonderful example of the churches participating, taking an active role in the transformation of society, and that is the Metropolitan Andriy Sheptitsky, the Greek Catholic leader who transformed Western Ukraine in so many ways between the two world wars. So he's actually a great example of what the church could be doing in the conditions of Ukraine today. Thank you.